You are tired of average. You want more out of life. You know you're capable of something greater. This show will help you become resilient in your home, at work, and in your community. Welcome to the Resilient Humans Podcast with your host, Kevin Wood. Welcome back to the Resilient Humans Podcast. I'm excited for this guest today because for 20 years, Dr. Scharff has researched complementary mental health practices to improve addiction and trauma treatment outcomes. And this has led her on a global journey in which she's discovered the commonalities amongst mental health practices globally. She just completed a year-long 7-nation exploration of everyday bravery, and she's now putting together a 12-nation investigation on human resilience. Dr. Scharff, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you here because you are a resilience expert and you're on now on the Resilient Humans Podcast. So
yes,
I'd like to start with a question. What got you interested in human resilience in the first place?
I actually trained in international development, and I lived all over the world, and I saw people in very difficult circumstances face those circumstances with grace, with determination, with strength, and with purpose. And I was like, that's really interesting because my personal background, I come from a great deal of trauma. I had a lot of trauma growing up, and I drank to deal with that. So I am in recovery for more than 26 years now, but I used to drink 2 liters or more of hard liquor a day. I was a real drinker. And so this juxtaposition of people without the resources around me, physical resources that I had, who were facing difficult situations with strength and purpose, really got me interested in the idea. And someone said to me, one of my mentors said to me once, he said, "You're brave." And I was like, I don't know what that's about. But most people who have the kind of background that I have don't recover. They certainly don't go on to become internationally recognized researchers in the field of mental health. And I put those things together and was like, oh, wait a minute. I really have something to offer here, not only because of my personal background, but because of what I got to see during my travels. And that's how I came to the role.
Can you give us some examples of things that you saw? Like, what does that mean that you witnessed, bravery and trauma and that around the world? Just give us a few examples of that.
Sure. So in Kalacha, which is a small town in the very north of Kenya where the Gabra live, I was able to see, this was in 1992 during the Somali famine. So Somalis are flooding over the border to the east. And people who are barely holding on, who are facing famine themselves, who are losing their herds, their herders there, it's not suitable land for agriculture, and yet helping one another, sharing water resources, making sure that, as the Samburu, a population to the south of them, say, we rise or fall together. In Israel, seeing people who have been attacked, also helping their neighbors to make sure that everyone can get to a bomb shelter. I was in Israel at a conference and the sirens went off. I'm an American. I did not know what was happening. All the Israelis split. They're gone because you have seconds to get to a bomb shelter. I was having dinner. My waitress came back to get me to make sure that I got to get into the basement of the hotel too. Those are the kinds of things where people don't think of themselves and their self-interest first. That really piqued my interest in what it is that we can do for one another. Seeing in South Africa, one of my associates was one of the first Black people to be educated in a medical school in South Africa post-apartheid. those kinds of choices. See, if she'd been born 10 minutes or 10 years earlier, she wouldn't have had the choice to become a physician in South Africa. If she had been able to get out of the country, she would have had to get that education elsewhere and probably would not have been able to serve in South Africa. These are the kinds of things that are in everyday life that are of extreme interest to me.
Those are fascinating. And there's, I can see it. Like I understand because I've seen some of your stuff. I went through your bio. And so I kind of know what the common thread is with all of these things. Before we dive into that though, and I usually save this question for the end, but I'd love to hear your working definition of resilience. What does it mean to you?
So one of the things is I don't use jargon at all. I don't think it's helpful. And I just don't use it. So resilience to me is simply when we are faced with obstacles or challenges, as we all are in life, whether it's health or economics or political discourse, whatever it is, we all have life challenges. When we face that with courage, with purpose, and with determination. That's really what resilience is. The opposite of that, of course, would be trauma, and it's being overwhelmed by the circumstances. So when we're resilient, we're able to face those circumstances with courage and so forth and not be overwhelmed by them.
Does that has me thinking it's it's difficult in the moment, like when you're in the middle of it, like in the thick of the trauma, to not be overwhelmed by it. Is there like a moment where it kind of like ticks over, like you're kind of stuck, you have blinders on, it's everything's bad, woe is me, and then it's like you can kind of see the light? Is that kind of like hope almost?
Well, I mean, hope is certainly a part of it. I mean, I consider myself a hope dealer. I mean, that's what I'm trying to encourage and foment and foster in the world is this idea of hope. Um, I think people kind of go one way or the other in the moment when the traumatic event is happening, in the car crash, in the assault. Most people just shut down. It's what you do with it afterwards, right? I was on a plane many, many years ago that had difficulty, smoke billowing in. I mean, we thought we were all going to die. We had to abort the takeoff. It was terrible. I'm great in that circumstance because everything shuts down and I just do the next thing, help people to get off the plane, help the people who are confused to move forward. Like there's nothing emotionally going on there. I'm just focused on, so yes, that does happen. They're just focused, but resilience is what happens after the fact.
Gotcha.
Resilience is how do I respond to that?
I like that you use the word respond because that's much different than the word react. It's a different, has a different meaning to it.
Well, it does. It does have a different meaning. And also reaction is what's in the moment, right? Like if you cuss me out, I probably will laugh. That's my reaction because I probably didn't deserve it. If I did, I'll probably say, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry," right? But my reaction is, "Who? What are you doing? Like, who do you think you are?" Right? But my response will come after the moment. My response will be, "Oh, do I want a person like this in my life? Why do they see me that way?" So I have choices there. Response is about choices. Reaction, there's no choice. It's just that's what happens.
So you've been working on what's called the Human Resilience Project. Can you
Yes.
tell us a bit about that and what is involved with that?
Yeah. So the Human Resilience Project is the umbrella for my research. And I collaborate and partner with researchers around the world. One of the things that is missing in modern academic research are the voices of Indigenous and marginalized populations. I actually this morning just completed a grant application and they said, who are your Indigenous voices at the PhD level? Well, there aren't very many of them. because we weren't trained. When I started with the Society for Consciousness Studies, which is a think tank, an organization of researchers who study consciousness, I was shown pictures of everyone who was speaking at our first conference, and it was all elderly white men and me. And I was like, that's not okay. And the founder of the organization, Alan Combs, he said, well, we were the only ones who were trained in the 1950s. And so now that has shifted, right? And so what we do is engage with scholars about human resilience and also open doors and make room for those people who have been left out of the conversation to join in the conversation, because they have a lot of very good things to share, to say there is wisdom there. In the same way, one of the issues that's going on in the United States is research around heart disease, and an understanding that heart disease has been researched really as a men's issue, really as a white man's issue. And so when you have women who have very different symptoms of a heart attack, for example, right, we need research there. So that's what I'm trying to do in the world of mental health, is to say we could learn so much if we didn't have such a narrow scope of inquiry.
And what's the grand vision here? Like, let's say, looking 10 years out, what do you hope to be different?
Well, I became interested, of course, because I initially started my research at the intersection of addiction and trauma. And as I traveled the world speaking about best practices in addiction treatment, I would get myself invited to countries I wanted to visit, right? I really love the global South. Comes from my training in international development, right? I just love those cultures. And I like anything that's different than what I have, right? Anything that's different, I want to know more about you. And what I began seeing as I was able to visit indigenous groups, marginalized groups in these nations, I was really seeing a lot of trauma related to climate change. But I was also invited in to speak with traditional healers, shamans, curanderos, sangomas, Buddhist monks, even, who have a different vision of what mental health looks like, a vastly different worldview on what mental health looks like. And I saw the commonalities there, particularly around storytelling and music. And I shifted over to looking at what wisdom we were losing. And as these groups are pushed out, and as climate change, low-lying island nations are on the precipice of being submerged and so forth. So what I want to do is really cultural preservation, capturing that information, but also digging deep into the similarities, the commonalities between us, so that we can apply this knowledge to all people everywhere. Because mostly, if you look at ethnographies, if you look at anthropology, when we look at, when scholars look at different groups, we focus on the differences, right? And so instead of looking at the fact that every culture that I've ever encountered, and I doubt there will be an exception to this, uses storytelling, narrative to address mental health, instead of noticing that commonality, we're like, well, that group does it in a community group way, and that group does it with an individual vision quest, and they have feathers and they dance, and we get distracted by the differences. I'm interested in the similarities because those can be applied cross-culturally. And that's what I'm looking for. What is it in humans, not cultures, in humans, that allows us to be resilient?
I saw one of your videos that talked about the idea of connection
Yeah.
and the importance of that. Can you
Yeah.
describe how and why that's important?
Yeah. So that comes out of addiction research. And 30, 40 years ago, we thought that the curative or recovery from addiction was sobriety, right? Abstinence from drugs and alcohol, which is certainly for many people important. But what we found is that the curative or the opposite of recovery or of addiction is actually connection. Recovery is connection. We do not recover in isolation. And you see this even in physical disorders. If you have a loving and supportive community around you, you are more likely to have a better and more complete recovery from cancer than you are if you are isolated. Now, we saw this in addiction in rat studies, and there were these famous rat studies where if you put a rat in a cage by itself and you give it the option of water or water with whatever,
I think it
cocaine
was
or
laced with
heroin.
cocaine. Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah,
remember
it's
these
cocaine.
studies.
So they've done heroin
Yeah.
once too, but whatever your drug of choice is, right? You put it in there, the rat will drink itself to death, right? It'll take so much cocaine or so much heroin that it dies. So, okay, so the drug is the problem. We know in addiction treatment, the drug is not the problem, because if I remove the drug, you should get better. You immediately get worse though. In detox, the individual immediately gets worse, not better. Now, if you're bit by a snake and I give you anti-venom, you get better immediately because the venom was the problem. The venom or the drug is not, it is a problem, but it is not the problem of addiction. So what happened is another researcher was like, these rat studies, rats are really social animals. What if we put the rats in a rat carnival, in a rat heaven? And so they put a bunch of rats in a maze situation together where they had food, they had water, they had company, they had toys to play with, anything they wanted, and also access to the drugs. And the rats didn't die. So we learned from that like rats, humans are social animals. I don't like to compare us to rats, but in that way we are similar. Humans are social animals. And so if we are in connection, we can recover. I saw this all the time in the addiction treatment center that I worked for, that if someone comes in and says, I'm a lost cause, can't help me, I'm going to die. My job was not to prove you right or prove you wrong or even to engage in treatment. My job was to help you change that story so that you thought you had a chance, which is why I share my story to say, listen, guys, I was on my way out. 2 liters of liquor a day, you don't live through that. And yet, I've had a vastly different life trajectory. You can too. So that's the value of connection. And you see that in cultures around the world, especially indigenous cultures. You see much less of that in the West, in the US and Canada and Great Britain and so forth, because we've got this insular idea that we should be able to do everything on our own.
Accurate. Totally agree.
You know,
When you said that person said, I'm a lost cause, does that equate to I feel alone?
Oh, well, that's a really good question.
That's how I see it, because I've also experienced clients in that same realm. They're surrounded by people, but they still feel alone because of that lack of connection with,
because it is that lack of connection. Yeah, I would say that I agree. I have always classed it as a state of hopelessness. But I think you're right. I think that, as I think about it, I do think it is that isolation. We see it all the time. It drives me crazy because I'm old enough that I was born before cell phones.
Yep.
I graduated college before cell phones. So, but I don't have children. So but I'll go to a restaurant or a school or someplace where there are children. And they're all, and then, and we wonder why we have epidemic mental health problems among youth. Because you're literally sitting at the table and texting. I went to a friend's house and her kid texted her something from upstairs.
Yeah.
Right? And we wonder why we feel alone. We wonder why we don't have relationships. I see young people who do not have the ability to have a meaningful conversation with someone because they weren't taught to speak.
Even how to
How do
speak to
we,
somebody, right?
right? I had to distance myself in this last week from someone that I was working with because I'd set a boundary. I was like, you can't text me day and night, long missives. For me, in my generation, text is for I'm running late. If it takes more than 3 texts, and I was very clear about this, if it takes more than 3 texts, or if you need something complex, you need to call me.
Mm.
And they wouldn't stop. And they had told me that they had problems with social media, that they were inappropriate on social, to the point that they felt that they had to make a public apology for things that were said. And then I watched them on social media just blowing up other people and whatnot. And I was like, you don't have the ability to see that you're blowing up your life because you are afraid or unskilled or whatever the cause is to have a communicative, genuine interaction with someone.
So how do we fix that? How do we help others create that connection so that they don't feel alone, so that we don't have these mental health crises that are going on all over the place?
Well, it's going to be really unpopular, but the number one thing you do with youth in particular is you limit screen time. And I mean limit, like very little. Because this is not my area of expertise or my area of research, but there is a load of research that has been done that if you limit screen time and you engage with your children and with each other, that you will have more meaningful connections. I also think it's critically important that all of us have activities and connections outside of work. I think of my grandparents who would be 115 now if they were still alive. So we're talking back the generations. My grandfather, when he retired, and people of his generation, when they retired, they died. They died because my grandfather had no connections out of work. He had one friend who was a cousin of my grandmother's, right? And my grandmother, that was it. There were no meaningful, and his sister. There were no other connections. There was no one to have lunch with. There was no, we got him involved in volunteer work. He went and read stories to school children. Again, this is back before school shootings too. He would go in and read stories to, I don't know, they were second graders or something. And we would go to the library and find books. So then we built a relationship with the librarian, and then there was a relationship with the teacher. We have to have these meaningful connections. And what that means socially is we have to shift our expectations around work. Because at least here in the United States, and I suspect it's very similar in Canada, we are expected to work all the time. And if we try to pull back from that, most of us won't make our bills. And so prioritizing work-life balance, right? But
I love that you put that in quotes.
Yeah, well, because it's ridiculous. Prioritizing, in my view, family and connection, and doing enough work to sustain ourselves is really the direction we would need to go if we want to build these connections and change this culturally. But in the meantime, limiting screen time. And that's not just for youth, that's for ourselves.
Correct. Yep. I'm happy that local schools around here are now banning cell phones in schools.
Starting to happen here as well.
Stay in their lockers. Like you said, there's a overwhelming body of research that supports this to say if they're on their phones all the time during the day, for one, learning doesn't happen. And then two, and more importantly, the connections don't happen because literally they're all sitting at the same. I was a teacher. They were all sitting at the same table, texting each other. You're sitting across from each other and you're still using it. So yeah, I totally get that. And then the other thing you talked about is having something outside of work. We call that your third place. So generally you have your work, your home. Well, what's that third place for you? For me, it's outside. I love being in nature, going out of my four-wheeler, playing disc golf in the woods. It's just, that's my third place where I can stay grounded and still connect with other people. Like last night was league night for disc golf. You partnered up, you get put on a card with other people that you get to play with, and you get to make these new connections every Tuesday. And it's amazing. And that's, again, something else that is missing is because people spend most, if not all of their time, either at home or at work, maybe the grocery store.
So I'll tell you an interesting thing about that third place is, so for me, I also love the outdoors, but I ride horses, and I like elderly horses because they tend to be pretty chill. And my desires in riding are pretty chill. Like my horse is essentially a living bench most of the time. We might walk around a little. I like to do little fussy things that make us look very pretty in the arena, and then we're going to hang out and eat carrots, which is a great way for a horse to be retired. But my elderly horse passed in December, and so at the moment I don't want another horse. He was my guy, and I don't want another one at the moment. That will at some point change, but from December until now, I have really noticed I don't go out as much. Because I don't go to the barn. I used to go to my friend's barn where I boarded him. I used to go to my friend's barn almost every day. I like at least 5 days a week. And those connections, the interpersonal connections are still strong because she understands, right? She's lost horses too, that you don't necessarily want another horse right away. But it's very different. I mean, I've really seen in my own life what it means not to have that third place and not to be going and interacting with those people on a regular basis.
You're mindful of it. You understand it.
Very much so. Very much so.
My daughter also rides horses too. So
I
totally get where you're coming from.
Well, and one of the things too is I am one of those researchers. I like to apply everything to myself. That's one of the reasons I got involved in mental health research is my trauma symptoms were so bad that I was like, let me try all these, because I focus on complementary therapies that have few or no side effects, right? So if you're writing a song, for example, singing has tremendous positive impacts on the brain. But if you're writing a song and singing it, what happens? The song's not going to win a Grammy. You don't finish it in the time allotted. You aren't in that top 1% of singers. Like you aren't particularly talented. By the way, your brain doesn't know if you're talented or not. It only knows that you sing or you don't sing. And so so I apply all that stuff to myself. Well, some of it doesn't work for me, even if it works for other people, but why not try it and then share what works. And that's where, my first book, Ending Addiction for Good, that's where that came from. Is I was like, I'm going to try all this stuff on myself, because I want to get better. So when I read research that says, oh, hey, we need this third place, we need these connections, we need that, and then I have that experience where I've had it and lost it in this case, I was like, oh, wait a minute. At least anecdotally, at least in my case, what they said absolutely played out. So it helps me personally to validate research, what to believe and to implement.
Very cool. What are some other practical ways that you could, I guess, impart on my listeners so that they understand how they could build their resilience in their everyday life?
Ooh,
that's a big question, I know.
Yeah, it's a big question because there's lots of things that you can do. I think the biggest thing about resilience that I notice is it's about mindset.
So what's your definition of mindset? How do you describe that?
I would say it's the inner narrative that you tell yourself, the stories that you tell yourself.
Beautiful.
So if you have a negative perspective, if you see the world as a victim, and I'm going to give a controversial example here, but former President Trump, we had the debate last night. But if you watch his rallies, if you listen to him when he speaks, there is a dialogue that I cannot imagine is not part of his inner dialogue, right? Because what we say outwardly is what is usually what we're saying to ourselves inwardly is, I've been wronged, it's not fair, I've been taken advantage of, and so forth. It's a victim's mentality in a lot of ways. There's bravado and grandiosity there too, but it's a victim's mentality. Whereas we use the term survivor for someone who has been sexually assaulted or raped, right? They are a sexual assault or a rape survivor, not a rape victim, not a sexual assault victim. And that's very important language. So I think the most important thing is to identify and understand your inner dialogue. And I did not see, and I say this for myself because I think that this is common, just how negative my own inner talk was. And so I said something about myself once to a friend, and he came at me, really aggressively, and he said, "Don't talk about my friend like that." And I was like, dude, but I got it. Because the things I say to myself about myself, I would never consider saying to or about someone else. Because if they were truly that bad, they're sick. Like there's the pathology, like there's something really wrong there. And I would have compassion for that, at least on some level. I mean, I look, serial killers. The Green River Killer was just recently moved from a prison way in the boonies back to a prison nearest to Seattle, where I live in this part of the country. And so everyone's, ooh, is there a new case? Which there may be a new case involved. He's, 40 some odd, murders. I certainly don't want him out on the street to, kill but someone who does what he did, there's a sickness there, right? And so, I mean, that's not normative. That's not normative. And so I want to have compassion there. But if I would say those things about myself, well, how am I supposed to, if I have this terrible inner dialogue, how am I supposed to do great things in the world? I just this morning before this interview finished a grant application to fund my research project. And when you write a grant application, you sell yourself. It is a job interview, right? It is, I'm great and I'm wonderful and this is what I do and no one else in the world does it like me and you should choose me and you should send me your money and I'm going to go out in the world and make you proud, right? You can't do that if you think you're a POS. You can't do it. It falls flat and you can read the disingenuousness of it. It
Right.
comes through, right? So I think that's probably the most important thing. But so changing that inner narrative, but let me give you, you and the people listening a tip. We all feel bad at some point, right? Things happen, don't go our way. It's not, and we just have bad days. Sing. If you are stuck in traffic and you do your own carpool karaoke, turn on the radio and a song you love comes on, I always put 80s on because I always love that little, and sing. Your brain has a neurological and biochemical reaction to singing. First of all, the whole brain lights up when we look at fMRI scans. The whole brain lights up. The whole brain is activated and it dumps serotonin, oxytocin, and dopamine. So you feel better. Now, I'm going to assume that you and I have fairly standard brain chemistries. So if I'm feeling bad and I'm in my car and I sing a couple of songs, I'm going to go from here to here when those brain chemicals, those feel-good chemicals drop. But if you're in an addiction treatment center or you're early in recovery, and I used to do this when I was early in recovery, I would go for a drive and put on Boy George singing the Hare Krishna song. Of all things, that's what made me happy. And sing. They're not producing, those individuals are not producing standard levels of brain chemicals because we've been, ingesting from outside and playing chemist with that. So the brain isn't doing that. So they go from the basement to the attic and they get high, a natural high. And what that does is it encourages them to stay in treatment. They feel good. They understand that recovery is possible. They understand that natural highs are possible. They are more engaged in treatment. They are friendlier and less aggressive with other people in the treatment program. We've seen all these things, but try it for yourself. Again, your brain doesn't know if you're good. It only knows that you do it. So if you're not feeling good, sing. I would want to give a third thing, and that is that I think in the West we overpathologize problems. Everything, especially the United States with our for-profit medical system, you have to have a diagnosis to see a doctor. Well, a diagnosis, a therapist, right? A diagnosis means there's something wrong with you. If your loved one dies, your parent, your spouse, your child, your dog dies, you're going to feel sad. We call that grief. That is a normal process of emotional expression. It is not pathological. And so, but if you have a pathology, you can also get a prescription. If your loved one dies and 6 weeks later, someone says, "Oh, you're depressed. Let me give you an antidepressant," it will do nothing to help your situation. You have to process the emotion of grief. That doesn't mean that there aren't people who have a neurochemical disorder and benefit from these medications. But I think that we are, especially in the United States, we are way too quick to medicate and way too quick to define something as pathological, as wrong, as diseased, as inappropriate, when they are just basic expressions. When I say something of life, when I say something is normative, right, that's just average. But we have people who are more sensitive than other people. We have people who are quicker to anger than other people. That becomes a problem if you're so quick to anger that if someone looks at you askance, you bash them in the nose. Well, now we have an issue, right? But if you just realize, man, that person pisses me off, that's a normal expression of human emotion. And I think we need to give ourselves more credit. We used to, if you were feeling bad, you could go over to your friend's house and have a coffee. But see, we don't have those connections anymore, right?
Accurate.
Someone has a new
Yep.
baby. I'll go over to their house, right? One of my close friends, I'll go over to their house. I'm not really into holding the baby, so you can hold the baby. But do you need your kitchen cleaned? Because we have these expectations that you can do it all. You cannot do it all. I'm an expert. I'm here to tell you, you cannot do it all. And you certainly cannot do it all alone. Right? And so we have to rely on each other. Right now, I have someone out there painting my house. They're painting my house because if I bend over for too long, my back goes out. Okay, I need help. I'm too old and my back's not good enough. I just accept that. I accept that. We don't always do that, though.
I've talked about on this podcast before the concept of tribes, and that's how we got to where we are today. We wouldn't be around if it wasn't for the tribes that we were basically bred in.
Yeah.
I see that as a missing component in our society these days. And I do my best to create my own tribe. I own a gym. I own CrossFit Moncton. And within that, we have a tribe and we take care of each other. And it extends to the newborn child that comes in and their mom who feel isolated and alone and the world is hard and they can't do everything themselves. And we put them in a group together of other new moms with their children. It's insane because in the middle of the workout, they're all helping each other's children. It's amazing to see. And that's creating their own little tribe of connection and culture. And then it goes to the other end of it as well. We have a master's program. My mom is 76. She coaches that class. All the old little ladies, they're all loving it because a lot of their friends have died. They're getting older.
Yep.
And that's just what happened. Now they have this little tribe and connection group that they can meet 3 times a week. And that's just helping. It's helping with their mental health. It's helping with their resilience, and they're being better as a result.
It's so important. It's so important. And, the downside of tribes is it can make us xenophobic, right? If you're not in my tribe, then you're somehow an enemy. And that's always shocked me because when I have traveled around the world and been with literal tribes of people, little bands of clans and whatever, I'm so interested in how they live in the world, and they adopt me in. I was just I was just in New Zealand in January and was adopted into a family. They're like, because I want to know how you do what you do. It's fascinating to me. But the other part of that is what you're talking about, the positive side of that. When I was an undergrad living in Kenya, I was talking with women about children. How many children do you want to have? What does family planning look like? And they have, in this part of the country, one husband will have multiple wives. And a lot of that is a survival strategy. But I said to them, what do you do if a woman is infertile, is barren and can't have a child? And one of the women looked at me, and these are young, like 20s, 30s, young, a lot of young women. And they looked at me like I was crazy. Like, we give them one of ours. Which on a practical side, if you've had 8 and one has none,
you can have 4. How about that?
Right? It makes sense, right? From a practical perspective. But it's more than that. It really is this idea of these women want to be mothers. And if you have been so blessed with so many, of course. Now the children know, they all grow up in the same compound. The children know that's my birth mom. But the one that raised me is my mother. And they talk about it like that, but they were so confused. They were like, if you can't have a baby in the US, someone doesn't just give you one. I was like, yeah, no, that's not how it works. Yeah,
No.
not at all. Not at all. And they were shocked by that you would keep your blessings to yourself. Just as if a child is hungry, if they're all down at the river washing clothes and a child is hungry, it might not be their mom that they latch onto and breastfeed from. It could be anyone who's breastfeeding. They don't care. There is that kind of connection. We don't see that enough in the States or in Canada.
Yep. Accurate.
But it is vitally important.
Dr. Scharff, this has been an amazing conversation. And is there anything else that you'd like to touch on before we sign off today?
Well, like I said at the beginning, I really see myself as a hope dealer. And I just want people to know that even in the most horrific and astonishing and negative circumstances, there is recovery. And there are opportunities for connection and for healing. And you don't have to be alone, because there are people like you, like me, who are in your community who really do want you in their tribe, in their circle, in their sphere of influence, who would delight in you as you are authentically. So if there's breath, if you're on this side of the dirt in the morning, there's hope.
Dr. Scharff, where can my listeners find you and connect with you?
So I can be found on all the social medias at Dr. Scharff or at Doc Scharff. I have a website, which is constancescharff.com, and the Human Resilience Project can be found at thrproject.com.
Beautiful. Thank you again for coming on the show. I appreciate you and your experiences that you've shared with everybody today. I know there's a lot of takeaways from this, a lot of possibly some aha moments for some people as well. So thank you again. I hope
so. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest episodes, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.